There was a very, very vociferous, backlash against hangings in the state of Texas, and especially against Mexican people being hanged. Ortiz, I do not believe, knew English, but he was put through a trial that was done in English, and was executed essentially in English. It was a spectacle. It was a public hanging, is what it was. But it was not Ortiz who killed her husband. So Ortiz was hanged for rape. That's what happened. The context for why is it that there was only one public hanging, one execution? And I think that the argument is that people didn't want to see this, over and over again. And I think that's actually a story of redemption for this community.
Hi everyone, I'm in Edinburg, Texas. Only one person was ever executed in this remote county. He didn't speak English, yet his trial was held in English. He didn't kill anyone, and it seems that the local community was never comfortable with this hanging. The site where he was executed in 1913 is now part of the Museum of South Texas History. We're going to meet his CEO to have a deeper insight on this case and to learn a bit more about the region's past.
They executed a 21-year-old who couldn't understand his trial. 21 candles, fate decided on a file. Words flying past him in cold legal style. History remembers even after a while.
My name is Francisco Guajardo. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Museum of South Texas History in Edinburg, Texas. It's a big steel door, and so I'm going to close this. So hopefully somebody from the outside can open it for us, but notice right there. And so this is where the jailer could talk to the inmates, if you will. So this county jail was inaugurated in 1910 when Hidalgo County was growing in the early 20th century. The county leaders built a jail. For a few centuries, the ranching industry had reigned supreme. Probably the early 1600s, maybe early to mid 1600s, all the way up until about 1900 and even into the first couple of decades of the 20th century, it was ranching. That was the economy, that was the culture, social structures around the ranching economy. The politics were also governed by ranching. But there was a new way that came to South Texas, the age of modernity. What with the advent of technologies, the train coming down here, the land parties coming down here, and then because of the Mexican Revolution on the south side of the border, there were a lot of people who were pushed out of Mexico, and many of those people were pulled into the economy here, and many Mexican people were then hired to clear the brush. And so to clear the brush means to clear the thorn forests of nopales, cactus, of mesquite, and other very thorny kind of flora. All of that was cleared to make way for the railroad and for the creation of new towns. So this here was a new town when the jail was built here. Abram Ortiz, who was a 20-year-old kid with another friend of his, together they committed a crime. They followed a couple that was walking north from Hidalgo, and they jumped out of the brush one day and they accosted this couple, and with a big piece of wood they hit a man over the head and killed him. And they took his wife, the woman, and they raped her. The woman would then escape. She would alert the authorities, and the authorities would then come to look for Abram Ortiz and his accomplice, a guy named Gonzalez. Gonzalez would escape, and he would flee into Mexico. Ortiz was captured and brought to this jail.
And Ortiz, was he an American citizen or was he a Mexican citizen?
Ortiz was a Mexican citizen, and Ortiz, I do not believe, knew English, but he was put through a trial that was done in English, and was executed essentially in English.
What do we know about him?
We don't know much about Ortiz. I mean, he was a laborer, so that's about as much as we know, that he was a common man, he was a laborer, and he was very young. He was 20 years old, and when he was hanged, he was 21.
And his accomplice left for Mexico, and we never heard of him again, right?
Abram Ortiz's accomplice did flee into Mexico, and there are stories of how he came back later in the 1920s, and he was actually caught later in the 1920s, and then justice was served to him, not through a hanging though. There's a press clipping that found that he was caught and sent to jail.
You want to take us to where Ortiz was hanged?
Yes. So Ortiz would have been taken from this corner cell, and if you follow me, I'm going to take you right to the death watch cell, which is where he waited for what would become a very public event. I am walking through the waiting room here and into the hanging room. And so this is el cuarto de la horca, or the hanging room, the gallows, if you will. And so the trap door that we see in front of me is the original trap door. Ortiz was brought here on this day in May the 2nd, 1913. And there was a public outside. There was an audience of about 20 people that came from different parts of South Texas to witness the hanging of Abram Ortiz. And so it was a spectacle. It was a public hanging is what it was. So the noose was placed around Ortiz's neck, and then the deputy sheriff, a fellow by the name of Polo Jackson, Nathaniel Jackson, would then release the trap door, and Ortiz's body would then fall to its death. And no member of Ortiz's family came to claim the body. So it was actually a very sad event, for Ortiz, for the family, for the community, and of course for the person that Ortiz killed and that person's family as well, and his wife, who was a witness at the trial. And so she testified it was actually Ortiz who had been one of the two rapists, but it was not Ortiz who killed her husband. It was the other fellow who had beat the man with a big wooden stick on the head. And so Ortiz was hanged for rape. Yeah, that's what happened.
He didn't speak English. The trial was in English. Did he have a chance to say he was not the one who killed him?
I don't know the specifics of the trial because we don't have a record of that. But what I do know is that the people who were the jury. The jury was all men, and they were all English speaking. And Ortiz was not English speaking. And so there is a question of whether he was tried by a jury of his peers. They were peers, I think, in a different context, but not necessarily of Ortiz's peers.
I still want to come back to the fact it's the only hanging ever here. Was it the only crime, the only rape, the only murder that ever happened here?
Ortiz's crime was not the only rape. Ortiz's crime was not the only homicide. There have been many of those in the history of this county. This has been the only sanctioned hanging in the history of Hidalgo County. And we know that there were many, many hangings. There were many, many lynchings along this borderland before the 20th century and even after the 20th century. We know that there was a lot of that kind of crime and violence around here. There's no question about that. But in terms of them being sanctioned and being legal, this is the only one.
And do you have any explanations about this? Any clue?
Well, I think that the Abram Ortiz hanging was because the leadership in the state of Texas had not felt the wrath of protest against hangings, because there was a very, very vociferous, backlash against hangings in the state of Texas, and especially against Mexican people being hanged. There were a number of people in the San Antonio area who actually rallied around this very issue and protested against the governor of the state of Texas. They protested against Governor Colquitt, who would then put a stop to hangings because he was getting a lot of political pressure. So I think that there was a lot of political pressure against the hanging of people and against this kind of violence, that Texas would then stop the hanging. It didn't mean that Texas stopped the execution of people, but they moved to other technologies, such as chairs and lethal injections and those kinds of things. So Texas did not subside in the execution, but it did in the hangings of people.
And why was there such a controversy on hanging itself? Is it because there were a lot of botched executions or other reasons?
I think that the reason for the pushback against hangings was really a movement in the early 20th century as part of a broader movement called the progressive movement. And the progressive movement was in part led by the temperance movement, the women's movement, a movement that had certain kind of moralistic values that was really pushing back against being more violent, as state-sanctioned practices. So I think it was really kind of a growing moral type of movement in this country that was very much a characteristic of the progressive movement of the early 20th century. I think that that's what led to the stopping of hangings. It's the same movement that led to temperance. It would then led to a constitutional amendment called prohibition. And so that movement actually carried kind of the moral spirit of this country. And this was not a progressive movement only in the United States. In fact, it comes from Europe, this movement in France and in England, toward the, I think, the right to vote for women. I think toward pushing back against avarice and alcohol consumption and those kinds of things. And with that also comes the hanging of people. So it's part of a broader movement of kind of virtue and morality.
Just a word about this building here. This room was really made specifically for hangings, right?
This room was made very specifically for hangings. This room was designed for hangings. This room was designed to teach the public about what not to do. And so in the structure, in the architecture of the place, there is messaging that is undeniable and inescapable. If you're out there and you're seeing a hanging, you know that you don't want to do that. And so this is actually a deterrent in architecture. The Museum of South Texas History is a repository of archival and artifact material of South Texas and northeastern Mexico. This is a very important institution that helps us understand who we are. It's basically putting a mirror in front of us so that we can look at ourselves historically. And even this story of Abram Ortiz, as I think as brutal as it is, I think is undeniable as a story that happened here. And it is how law and justice was meted out at that time period, and a lot of people didn't like it. And because a lot of people didn't like it, it's the reason that it had happened only once. And I think that's instructive, and I think that it's important to understand the context for why is it that there was only one public hanging, one execution. And I think that the argument is that people didn't want to see this, over and over again. And I think that's actually a story of redemption for this community.
You think the community was somehow traumatized by this hanging?
I don't know if the community was traumatized by that hanging because I don't have the evidence to make that argument. What I can say is that of the 15,000 children who come through here every year as part of school tours, that you can go back 20, 30 years ago of the children who used to come in here to visit the museum, that this is what they remember. So maybe children, maybe, I don't know if it's traumatized, but they go through an experience of how this becomes an impressionable experience in their lives. They saw it and they're impacted by it. So I think that this becomes very dramatic, as a lesson for life.
10 years after this execution, all the county hangings were stopped in Texas. All executions had to take place in Huntsville. And guess how? With the electric chair. Yes, it was seen as less barbaric than hangings. What do you think? Please continue to subscribe and to share this work, this YouTube channel, and these podcasts. I also created a paid membership for those who want to support this work and have access to exclusive content. Thank you very much.